The foundation concepts of system dynamics arise from the nature of what we call feedback loops. A feedback loop exists around and in the control of essentially everything that changes through time. A feedback loop implies that some action is going on, that action changes the nature of the surrounding system, and as the nature of the surrounding system changes, it provides new information to control action in the future, an ongoing process in which action is never unidirectional. Act, finish, that's it, but act, change the situation. The changing situation sets up new criteria for action. And we can illustrate that in the very simple process of simply filling a water glass, where we see the flow of water increases the water level. And if one casually asked a person what happens when you fill a water glass, they might simply say the water flows out of the faucet and fills the glass. And that would be half the story. The other half would be that the water in the glass is controlling the faucet, because the water in the glass is being observed. There's information about the level of water. We compare the level of water with the desired level and use that to control the flow of water. So wherever we see action taking place, we'll see also some kind of process that controls it, and therefore fits into the idea of a closed loop, a closed circuit of control. If we would stylize that and move from that diagram to the equivalent system dynamics symbols, we find that there is a rectangle. We ordinarily use a rectangle to represent the accumulations or integrations, in other words, the water in the glass. There is a policy governing some rate of flow. In the previous diagram, that was the water flow. Information about the level comes back to the point where decisions are being made. Information is being compared with some goal to control the action. Now, that seems naively simple. It is probably the simplest possible system. But lest we think that all life is that way, let's go to a system for the moment that is only 5 times as complicated. You're not expected to read the print on this, but simply to look at the nature of the picture. And I say it is 5 times as complicated because there are 5 levels. There is, in this case, a diagram of the world dynamics model in the world dynamics book. There is population, which is increased by birth, reduced by deaths. There are natural resources that are being depleted. There's the amount of capital plant in existence producing goods. There's capital plant in agriculture, and there is the amount of pollution in the environment. The greater complexity arises because each of the flows into and out of these levels can be influenced by any or all of the rectangles in the system. So you get a very much more complicated looking system, even though there are only 5 levels in it. I would like to talk about some of the underlying principles surrounding these feedback loops. So let's go back to the previous diagram and talk about some of the concepts that are visible here and yet are, I would say, universal in all systems, whether they be human systems or physical systems. One we've already spoken of, all activity controlled in feedback loops, embedded in a feedback control process. Within these systems, there are 2 kinds of variables, what we call the levels or the system states, and what we call the rates of flow or the policies. Not only are there these 2, but there are only these 2. Anything you look at in a system will be one or the other. That's a very powerful statement, because if we come to believe it, and on first exposure probably people don't believe it, but when you come to realize that there are two and only two kinds of variables in a system, it makes the interpretation of real life observations very much more easy. And you should not find this surprising if you are familiar, say, with the accounting statements of a corporation, the annual report. You find that there are two pages. One is the profit and loss statement, the other is the balance sheet. And there is no third comparable page. And that's because the balance sheet represents the state of the system, the levels, the accumulations, the integrations, and the profit and loss statement represents the rates of flow during the year that caused those accumulations to change. A simple and fundamental idea, I'm told that in one of the schools in New Jersey, kindergarten students go through their environment picking out which are the levels, which are the rates, which begins to create the insight into the nature of systems, and then by fifth grade perhaps they're doing actual computer modeling. But the foundations start by just looking at real life. The water in the bathtub is a level. Your reputation is a level changed by the good and bad things you do. Your enthusiasm is a system level altered by various things that cause it to rise or to fall. We see in this diagram some other generalities I would say are universally true. That is that the system levels are controlled by the rates of flow and only by the rates of flow. A level is not controlled directly, instantly, by any other level. The number of people in this room is a level, an accumulation relative to some issue we might be concerned about in the building, and it represents the accumulation of all the inflows and all the outflows since this room was built. We are here now with a particular number of people. The number of people in this room does not directly control the number of people in some other room in the building, except as you leave this room and go to the other one. So there has to be the rate of flow in which the rates of flow change the levels, and conversely, the levels control the rates of flow, and no rate of flow controls any other rate of flow. So rates of flow are controlled only by levels. Levels are controlled only by rates. And again, this helps in the whole process of organizing a model and making the transition from real-world observations to the structure of a model that is supposed to represent the real world. In modeling, one has basically two broad kinds of flow rates. Those that are conserved. The water in the glass builds up, and although not shown here, it comes from a storage tank or a reservoir somewhere. The water in the reservoir is reduced, the water in the glass increases. It may not be important to deal with the water in the reservoir, so we show just a cloud here representing the decision that it doesn't matter where the water comes from. But if it did matter, we would have another stalk up here from which the flow occurs. On the other hand, there are the information flows between the levels and back to the rates, and these are not conserved. You can use information multiple times from a level to a variety of rates of flow. Any discussion of this? Yes.
You mentioned two characteristics of problems that we can apply system dynamics. One is feedback and dynamic behavior. Would you name other characteristics, or those would be all?
Well, we are primarily interested in how the structure and the policies in a system produce behavior. if you are interested in a truly static problem, and in some ways they're hard to find, but if you are interested in a truly static problem, you probably don't need system dynamics. You might say if you had a beam and a load on it, and you want to know how much it will bend and where it will be in equilibrium, you probably don't need dynamic analysis. On the other hand, if you want to know how it gets to that position and whether it vibrates when it gets there, then you are back into a dynamic system. So there can be truly static problems that I think are not of much interest to people in system dynamics. But there are a lot of problems that are cast as static problems that ought to be dealt with as dynamic problems. And in social sciences and economics, you see, for example, equilibrium modeling, which is very close to static modeling, where the real interest on people that look at the world economies are they're interested in how do we get there, how do we move from one place to another, do we move in a stable way, oscillatory mode, and so a lot of static modeling should be dynamic. But if it's truly static, I don't think you don't need system dynamics.
In the very beginning of your answer to that question, I think you said we're interested in system dynamics and how structure causes behavior. My sense is that we use these words structure and behavior rather specifically in the field of system dynamics. So could you maybe define what those two words mean as we're using them?
Well, by structure, I mean the kind of thing you see on the diagram, that there are system levels, integrations, accumulations. There are flow rates into those levels. They may be so-called intangible things like what improves your reputation. Reputation would be a system level if you were dealing with such. The structure includes what are the connections, what information is available at a decision-making point. In real life, there are many of these inputs to a particular policy. And then the structure deals with how many of them there are, and then the policy deals with how you interpret those information flows, which ones are influential, how influential, and how do they displace one another. Very often in ordinary circumstances, one or two of the inputs may be dominant, but under extreme circumstances like being out of money, perhaps the illiquidity of the organization dominates almost everything else. So you have shifting emphasis in the policy. So the policy says, how do we use information to produce action? And the structure says the action does what to changing the state of the system. And so we're talking about the structure as you see it on the diagram, and we're talking about the policies, which you don't see explicitly here. They would be represented by an equation that tells us how these inputs are interpreted into a certain amount of action. And those are the two main things in producing behavior. Nelson, what would you like to pull this together with?
I think that if we look at what system dynamicists do and what it is, the thing that I keep coming back to is what system dynamicists do, in a very simple answer, is they build models. And what system dynamics as a field has to be related somehow to models and modeling. And I think that may seem like a broad category, but there's actually a lot of fields in the social science and the natural science that are not model-focused the way that system dynamics is. And so I think there's a core assumption somewhere at the base of the field in the definition that says that by trying to articulate our understanding of the world in the forms of different types of models, whether they be pencil and paper or computer simulation models, that we're going to learn something useful. And I don't think every field believes that. So I think somewhere in the definition, it's really the notion that modeling is what matters, and that modeling, taking your understanding and put it into models of different formats, is a useful thing to do, and something that's going to lead you to understanding that you couldn't get otherwise.
But it seems to me that there is an aspect of system dynamics models that's not necessarily seen in other approaches to systems and other approaches even to modeling. And one of the central ideas lies in the concept of feedback systems, in which we essentially believe and say that every action of every sort in nature and in human endeavors occurs within a feedback loop that controls what is going on.
I think the beginning in some ways is even simpler than that. When you start a model, I certainly have this experience, and I think most people do. When you teach system dynamics, once you introduce people to the concepts of rates and levels, they never quite look at the world the same again. And I think one of the things that what makes that distinction so powerful is that as soon as you realize that there are rates and levels, anybody, after half an hour and a few examples, can then go to their own environment and begin to pick out what are the rates and what are the levels. And from there, they're already starting to model differently. Now, in this case, what's being influenced is their mental model, but they're not far from coming to more formal representations of the systems in which they live.